So, wir beginnen jetzt mit dem ersten Teil unseres Arbeitsschwerpunktes Border Effects, zu dem Sandra Nöth, die diesen Schwerpunkt kuratiert hat, eine Einführung geben wird. Vielleicht kurz zu ihrer Person. Sie ist als Kuratorin, Kulturwissenschaftlerin und Autorin tätig und seit 2015 ist sie Mitglied des Graduiertenkollegs Lose Verbindungen an der Universität Hamburg und zuvor leitete sie die Abteilung Dramaturgie und Research am Tanzquartier Wien. Sie arbeitet regelmäßig außerhalb Europas, unter anderem im Libanon, Palästina und in Nordafrika. Und als Dozentin lehrt sie international, unter anderem als Senior Lecturer an der Stockholm University of Arts und als Resident Professor bei Ashkal Alwan in Beirut. Ihr aktuelles Forschungsprojekt beschäftigt sich mit Rolle, Status und Handlungsfähigkeit des Körpers in materiellen und immateriellen Grenzprozessen, wozu sie auch schon sehr viel publiziert hat. Sandra, bitte.
Actually, I remember crossing the border for the very first time, like any other time afterwards. And after a while, one recognizes its movements, its procedures and formalities, the preliminary establishment of a network of kind of conditional hospitality, its manifest and immaterial infrastructure, the rhetoric, the passiveness and the waiting as well. But sometimes the movement of the border catches you by surprise and you don't see it coming. Usually when leaving the house to set off for another trip. And sometimes already long before in the middle of a conversation or at the supermarket's checkout or just when daydreaming. And still I feel it always kind of starts in the body. And there is this very familiar feeling of excitement and tension marked by a contradiction. And I remember revisiting and rehearsing the physical and mental movements of the border, trying to welcome them, like firmly yet cautiously navigating through space, placing my gaze, controlling my breath, listening to the sound of my body, lowering the voice, detaching, kind of uncoupling from any direct experience, projecting, letting go. Not too daring, but not afraid either. Disciplined, concentrated, and insecure, ready to improvise at any time. The movement of the border is restless and disquieting. Oftentimes it's creeping, gradual, accumulating, delayed, anonymous, often perceived much later or kind of long before, like an echo in the rhythm of life, like a continuous state of displacement unfolding slowly. And caught in a meticulously crafted texture of narratives and emotions, it feels that when encountering the border, my body doesn't belong to me anymore, as if I had lost autonomy about it. It's like entering an illogical reality, like moving back and forth between contested spaces, between countries and places, memories and expectations, between the unseen, the unsaid, what I don't have words for. It feels like traveling through interwoven, competing thoughts and feelings while staying unrecognized, like a kind of visitor in another person's or in my own story. So, borders are, of course, many things: material, architectural, constructed, symbolic, felt, fictional, and memorized, embodied, lived, always already there, always yet to come. And in a world in search of, a world which faces massive changes in its orders, the idea and the reality of the border is challenged continuously. Crises and collapses, environmental calamities, wars and their aftermath, migration and decentralization, but also, and this is important, I feel, on a much smaller scale, everyday experiences of exclusion, of non-recognition, of not being seen, of indifference and carelessness, which inherently alter the way we conceive of structures and systems, of maybe binary ideas of center and periphery, of the local and the global. Borders and bordering processes influence and structure artistic lives as well. on a very daily level. Traveling, residences, nomadism, flexibility, transcultural, transmedial, transnational experiences and profiles, and this is just some of the buzzwords of our artistic economic vocabulary. However, tightened visa procedures, changing legal frameworks for permits, and an observable rising number of travel bans and deportation, as some of our colleagues who could actually not make it to Hanover for the Tanzkongress are just bearing witness of, seem in a kind of staggering contradiction to an internationally acclaimed rhetoric of cultural exchange. Or as Michaela Krimen has put the paradox of it all, and I quote her, "Artworks must be unique and universal, able to communicate a sense of place and reveal specific context, while being largely understood by an international public. Glimpses of local, they have to exist on a global scale." So these very concretely observable phenomena resonate on a more symbolic, immaterial, practical, and I would say systemic level with the reintroduction of nationalist and other identitarian, but also disciplinary boundaries in artistic work and process. Censorship and self-censorship, for example, that artists and programmers face alike, implementing explicit or much more subtle underlying funding politics, for example, expectations, forms, etc. And these dynamics affect both the creation and production of artwork and their aesthetics, but also the way in which audiences and discourse around dance and choreography are set up and situated. They also motivated us to organize and to set up border effects as an integral part of this Congress, a forum and a working format dedicated to the reflection on and the experimentation with the complex effects of fracturing that the border introduces in the field and practice of dance and choreography. And in any case, I feel in this moment of time in which maps are redrafted and relationality teaches us that every part, every moment is part of a network in which freedom of speech and expression seem to enter a state of regression again, borders appear in their very physicality and performativity as something that is not irrevocably drawn, but porous, mutable, and shifting, which is not a rigid and immobile line of separation. So, of course, in the context of this Congress, the problem of the border kind of dialogues with the problem of contemporaneity. And in a kind of self-reflexive gesture, it questions how we construct, perform, maintain, legitimize, aestheticize, and represent our artistic, but also social, political, and other territories. It seeks to shed light on how we as dancers, choreographers, pedagogues, producers, thinkers, and curators, but also as a public, unsettle and maintain processes of in- and exclusion, how, for example, we circulate ideas and knowledge, how we work and how we live together. This concerns the role that art seeks and can play in this myriad texture of measuring out and claiming material and immaterial space. It questions, for example, how we can negotiate the gap between the political content of an artwork and its politics, and how we can create moments of, let's say, tension or suspension that allow us to redirect our gaze to the manifold borders and boundaries that have become very familiar and everyday, and in light of which a state of exception risks to be normalized. Mostly, borders are inhabited and populated by many different kinds of bodies. Waiting and everyday bodies, disciplined and trained, absent and invisible ones, bodies in fear, broken, ill, bodies in limbo, but joyful bodies as well. Bodies that witness often work against experiences of disorientation that borders introduce on many levels, and in which space and material, authority, order, and meaning are redistributed. They all appear as representative of and inscribed in an uncountable number of unnamed silent and silent cases and voices. They are suspicious bodies, hesitating, suspended between action and reaction, between response and responsibility, and they draw us into a dispositif of concurrent and concurring, unsettling readings of what we call reality. And they put us in touch with a much more brittle, preliminary, unstable, and incomplete idea of the border. So, of course, the human body and movement have been a long-standing subject to existing research on borders and bordering processes when, for example, looking in the interdisciplinary field of border studies that has expanded considerably from the 1990s onwards, of course, in light of the end of the Cold War, but also diverse other movements of decolonization. And here, the discussion or the interest in the human body focused mostly on the very concrete restriction and possibility of physical movement. And if we continue sketching out tendencies, the body in this context has been positioned as one amongst very different elements of mass mobilization, for example, when talking about refuge and migration. From a very different angle, the bordering body has been an important subject in human rights discourse and movement, standing in for the legal and juridical discussion of the integrity of the body. So how can a body stay sound and safe, unharmed, in light of these events? For instance, when analyzing also the body as a weapon or as a fighter, and I think if we remind ourselves of very current discussion on human shielding, for instance, that might be an example. But in summary, the above mentioned, of course, very incomplete perspectives on the body in relation to the border tend to value the materiality of the body, its objecthood, if you want. And at the same time, the symbolic potential of the body is key to bordering processes. And here, research has been undertaken that investigated the question of how the body enables and informs a legal, religious, political, national, ethnic, or gendered understanding, and above all, legitimization of borders. So, of course, the approaches that we are going to encounter in this border effects program react on and inscribe in these above-mentioned discussions. However, I feel they aim or they try to revalue and reimagine the role of the body, its status and agency in the production and representation of borders by drawing on knowledge that has been artistic and theoretical knowledge that has been developed in the field of contemporary dance and choreography, like knowledge that has been developed by the means or like in negotiation of physical and movement-based strategies. So, situating the discussion of the border in the field of choreography and dance does not mean or is not a proposal to downplay the impact and the violence linked to the reality of the borders, just to be very clear about that. But much more, the proposal is based on an understanding of choreography as a practice and a concept, but also as a methodological tool that has historically been engaged in composing, structuring, organizing, and undoing movement in time and space. It's a tool of analyzing and creating artistic but also societal and political modes and means of participation, of intervention and inscription. This places a reference, if you want, to what we might refer to as social choreography, exactly investigating the relation between artistic, physical and societal, civic, political and other movements. But we will hear more about this in the contributions that are upcoming in the next days. Following, however, the movement and the performativity of the human body shifts, I suggest, the discussion from the form and from the narration of the border to its very physical and visceral experience, to its residual effects. And more concretely speaking, it allows us to look, first, the choreography of bordering processes. For example, formalities, the preliminary or establishment of a network of invitations and infrastructure. For example, also thinking of interrogations, repetitive elements. I guess all of us might have experienced this. The confiscation of passports, the waiting, the rhetoric involved in border crossing, but also the kind of architectural and material frameworks of the border which define and provoke movements and which direct our gaze, but also our attention. Second, the strategies and experiences of embodying the border. For example, physical and mental movements and narratives that rehearse and actualize, that memorize, fictionalize, prepare, act, and react to the very moment of border crossing, as well as emotions, feelings, presence, and empathy, docility, and effect in the process. 3, the entanglement of different spaces in the process of bordering. For example, physical, mental, digital, and technological, architectural and political, but also private and public space, as well as the experience of expansion of the border in border crossing, expansion in a temporal sense, but also in a spatial sense. For example, when borders take on environmental qualities, when they are perceived, much before you actually encounter the border, or much later in terms of traumatic or psychological qualities, for example. And fourth, the everyday nature of bordering processes, that is the tension between rights that try to protect the freedom of mobility and expression, the freedom of accessibility in their very universal and international claim, and the tension towards, let's say, their realization, implementation, restriction, and also suspension in very concrete local contexts. In any case, I feel that the implication of the human body in the discussion once more complicates the notion of the border, as it doesn't place it in between two opposed or demarcating lines or entities, but kind of inside, within the body. When, for example, the normative effect of the border enters private and personal life, when it enters imagination. And all of this probably constitutes the border effects, like becoming border, to feel it and to carry it in your body before it becomes visible, smelling and sensing the border under your skin, before it finds into an imitable and exterior form. And this takes place and it shapes your body. It's a very physical and it's a visceral experience. Hidden memories that emerge and bodies that have to seem to have frozen in time, to fall out of time. So, as indicated in Border Effects in the title, the body in all of this appears as both a subject and an object of bordering processes. It is under the effect, it reacts on borders and boundaries, while at the same time generating, maintaining, and representing, reproducing them performatively. So following the body and if movements, borders here are exactly understood in their performativity as border zones or borderscapes, as complex and shifting, invented, and very dynamic networks and places of encounter. And also, in the moment of bordering, in its very physical and performative experience, collectivity is evoked, and my individual, my singular body becomes representative, becomes part or is part of a collective one, of other bodies, of the body of the other, when in the event of the border, a third collective body emerges. The neutralized, politicized, generalized, mimetic, expanded, forgotten, gendered, and often fleshless body of the collective. The body of the stranger, the refugee, the occupier, the religious, the exiled, which is exactly the same body as the body of the lover, the friend, the caretaker, and the lost one. So in becoming border, we are already many bodies at a time. So and in bordering, I suggest something common is referred to and actualized also, and the collective is kept intact, performed or rejected in the process. The experience of the border also points us to the wounded places in our lives. And here a wound in a very physical sense is of dual significance. It marks an intrusion into the body, a penetration of tissue, an attack on its integrity. But at the same time, the wound tells us of the body's ability to heal, to restore and to reorient itself and also its environment. Wounds entail a kind of twofold trajectory. They are signs and places of weakness, but they are also signs and places of empowerment. And the occurrence of a wound, the vulnerability of the body, allows us to experience or maybe to re-experience our individual and collective bodies. It bundles our attention and connects us to the injured bodies of our societies. And in analogy, if you want, to the responsive dynamics of the wound, also the experience of the border complicates the logic of cause and event, of responsibility and obligation. It draws us to the borders and boundaries in us, the border that is us, and thereby readdresses the question of agency. I think that the human body somehow introduces resistance to existing images and narratives of the border. It points us to the fact that our assumption and our knowledge of bordering processes are dynamic and constantly actualized. And above all, it shows us the impossibility of being outside of the border dynamics, the impossibility to think or move from a safe point, from a neutral or non-situated position. And the obligation, I feel, to reflect on the own involvement and participation in exactly the construction, representation, and legitimization of borders. In this sense, borders and boundaries seem to always be kind of associated with demarcation, now with processes of difference and identity politics. They presuppose a kind of relationship, a similarity. They confirm historical, hegemonial, cultural authorities and relationships. And the moment of transgressing the border also exposes us to our own kind of fantasies of unity and universalism. And here in this universalist perspective, I think here they are again. All those loud images, bodily, physical, and choreographed images that we have invented in order to be in touch with the borders and boundaries in our lives, with their disquieting movements, images of torn and harmed bodies cramped together in masses, dead and bleeding bodies. I guess we all recognize them, no? We've seen them before. Maybe we have stored them somewhere in a little bit of a safe distance. We have given them a form and a place carefully in a way that even when they appear in front of our eyes now, these days, we might have to look twice in order to understand if this is really happening now. And it's not only bad memories or an old dream. It's not far away, it's not in another country or in another's country, but pretty much part of our everyday. It's exactly now the disquieting movement of the border sneaking into our life. And I feel in light of this, the body needs and kind of is already more than a passive witness and a mere material of bordering process. It needs to become a body in, as, and of evidence. It needs to remind us that in all difference there is something we share. Thus, I propose that the human body introduces a kind of ethical dimension in the discussion of borders. It insists on the question of responsibility, which contains response. That means it insists on redirecting the question of the border towards ourselves, towards our own involvement and participation in its construction and representation, a responsibility which questions how we are all part of actually challenging or invisibilizing, of maintaining and creating borders in our own respective contexts. In resonance with these kind of ideas, we invited in Border Effect a group of dancers, artists, theoreticians, and experts from other fields to join us in these questions about the individual and collective agency, but also about the limits to it, I guess. And in the next 2 days, they will meet together with the public in order to address the problem of the border from their very respective artistic or discursive practices. And they will also try to address the question how art, how choreography, how movement-based practices might contribute to and eventually inform a more general understanding of the border. And tackling a broad and, of course, non-exhaustive scale of aspects, their proposal ranged really from the field of conflict research to the body as a site of power and vulnerability, to questions of citizenship, but also to borders and boundaries within dance practice. And very concretely speaking, following shorter dialogical lectures, impulse lectures, Dana Kaspersson, Guru Ertam, Tomislav Medak, Arkady Saides, Christine Vlade, Krisa Parkinson, Tom Klalim, and Khaled Shahrar invite us to share and dialogue with them in workshop situations. And a panel on Sunday hosted by Gabriel Smerz will try to bring together impressions and ideas and experiences. And I would already now want to sincerely thank them for having joined us. I want to thank you for having joined us in this kind of encounter, which follows, I feel, the gesture and also the necessity of searching and an attitude in which maybe bringing up questions from our practice might have equal force than providing quick or too quick answers. And with this attitude, I feel the idea of the border confronts us almost choreographically speaking, with the consequences and ultimately with the violence of our inscriptions. And I wonder how to act and how to move and how to write and how to speak to you as a body, a feeling and a thinking body. And maybe to wrap up these introductory notes, I propose to stay with a humble and open-ended and maybe all too evident kind of call. Not romanticism, and maybe also not so idealistic as it might seem, but the call to follow the movement, to follow the physicality and performativity of the body, and to not mistake borders as stable, preset, and unshakable structures and tools of power, to not only understand them as a primarily spatial, but also a relational category, as something that we continue weaving and that we contribute maintaining day by day, all of us. And then maybe the awareness of the border in us and the awareness of the border that is us. So, and the awareness of all the pain and suffering that is related to its realities. Maybe this might be a way to encounter the border and to move through contested space and to follow its very disquieting movements. This is disquieting, yes. And again, it probably asks us to leave our safe positions for a bit. And yet, there's absolutely nothing to claim and nothing to wait for. The ghosts that we have called for us are in the house for long. Thank you very much. Thank you.